I'm Larry Scogan. It's my good fortune to be the president, and we're really excited. Number one, we're excited that so many are here in our live audience. Clay said, imagine if weather had been good and there hadn't been football today. Well, and so we also appreciate the fact the Vikings aren't playing until 5:40 today, so that's certainly helpful. We're really excited today on a number of levels, and just to make some introductory comments here, we are actually, for those of you that have been coming, we've been talking about live streaming, and we're actually doing that today. And we have the videography classes here. We've got students that are actually doing some of the taping and some of the sound, and we've just got all kinds of exciting things going on here. And so we certainly thank all those folks that have been involved in that. And just to let folks know, we've got faculty member Mark Moxon is here, Scott Helfrey, we've got Dean Bellum and Robin Thorstensen. Joel Frank is actually back here someplace. The Bismarck Mandan Civic Chorus has had 3 performances here over the last couple of days, and so they're all hooked up to our sound. So Joel came in to help us out. Joel Frank, what did I say? Joel Adam? Adam's his son. Joel Frank is back here. And we have, and thank all of you for being here, but we have North Dakota's Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Scott Davis, is here. Mr. Commissioner, thank you for being here today. So we're just really appreciative of everybody being here. I'm a little bit nervous today, I will admit, from the other topics that we've talked about, because Clay and I have really struggled with this topic and how do you present this topic. And so I just want to make some opening comments about that, and then we're going to go into it. Oh, I should say also, administrative note, for those that are watching on live feed, we do have a Twitter account set up, and so if you're watching the live feed at home, you can go to Twitter and do @BSCTalk and send that to us, and I'll be refreshing my screen every now and then, and we'll be getting your comments or your questions. And if you're having trouble with it, do the same. If you're having trouble with the feed, and let us know, and I can tell the guys back in the booth there's something going on here. So we'll have instantaneous communications with the folks out there that might be watching us on live stream. So it's all very, very, very exciting.
Could we maybe just bring the house lights up a little?
Could we bring the house lights up just a little bit? Okay, thank you. That's fine. Thanks, and we can see who's all out here. The reason I said we're a little bit nervous about this topic is, and let me explain it from my perspective, and like I said, Clay and I have had a number of conversations about this. There are certain things that have occurred in history, American history, world history. There are certain things that get seared right into the cultural DNA of a people. And those things then become very, very strong symbols. And I'm thinking, for example, for African Americans, the whole issue of slavery, it's seared into the culture. And, you know, it's real easy for a lot of folks to say, well, you know, that's 100 years ago, that's 200 years ago, whatever the incident might be. And so it's just time to get over it and move on. But they're seared into the cultural DNA. When I think of Native American history, for example, we think of the Trail of Tears and the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma, how that is seared into their DNA. I moved up here from New Mexico, and down there the long walk for the Diné or the Navajo, when they were rounded up and they were taken out of their homeland in the Arizona and northwest part of New Mexico, and they did a long walk over to the eastern part of New Mexico. Terrible, terrible time in their history. And that is seared into their DNA, and they continue to memorialize that in so many ways. And thus we've picked a topic to talk about today that we know is larger than just a historic incident. It's a topic that is in fact seared in the DNA of not only the Lakota that we'll be talking about today, but it became a larger symbol of that for a number of reasons that we'll talk about today, but it became a larger symbol for Native Americans across the board. And so as we approach this, we know that we can be criticized for trying to take sort of a historical antiseptic view of something that really is a very, very large symbol. And so I want folks to know as we talk about this, and like I say, Clay and I have talked about this a number of times, as we talk about this, we want people to know that we do not miss the fact of the symbolism that is in fact seared in the DNA of the people that this happened to. And so I would just ask for folks that is part of their DNA or that are sympathetic to that part of the DNA, I would ask those folks to understand that we're trying to take a sort of a humanities view of a historical incident that we know has a much larger ramification than what we will even be talking about today. So I'm reminded as I talk about that, Francis Paul Peroutka is a historian that has done many, many works on federal Indian policies. And a number of years ago, he gave a paper at the American Historical Association on President Andrew Jackson. And as I already mentioned, the Trail of Tears is really seared into the DNA of particularly the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. And Father Peroutka, he's a Jesuit priest, and Father Peroutka got up in front of that assemblage and he said, well, let's talk about, rather than demonize Andrew Jackson, let's try to understand the political realities that drove him to make the decisions that he made. And there were a number of people that walked out of that conference because they believed that he was trying to take something that was larger than just a political incident. So I don't want anybody to walk out today. We hope that you understand that we're looking at a historical incident and acknowledging that it has a much larger symbolic meaning than we can even begin to talk about today. So at any rate, so that's why if I act a little nervous at the start of this, I really am, because we do realize the import of this incident. So, Clay, you wanted to start off here with a discussion?
Well, let me second that, but also to say that just to use your metaphor once, it's not just an incident that's marked on the cultural memory of Native peoples, and particularly the Lakota, but of all of us, because this incident that occurred on the 29th of December, 1890, in today's South Dakota came just a year after statehood. So now North Dakota and South Dakota existed, and the crisis wasn't just a South Dakota crisis, it had a lot of North Dakota implications. Sitting Bull is a part of this story, and the murder of, or the botched arrest of Sitting Bull on the 15th of December, 1890, was one of the precipitating factors of what happened 2 weeks later at Wounded Knee. And in reading about this, and you have a handout here, and if you just look at the back page briefly, we have a bibliography for you. And there's a rich and extraordinary literature about Wounded Knee, and you could spend months, even years, studying this this incident if you felt like it. But the book that I think is the best introductory book to read about Wounded Knee is Rex Allen Smith's Moon of the Popping Trees: The Tragedy at Wounded Knee and the End of the Indian Wars, published in 1975. And I was rereading that book yesterday. This was the hardest one of all the series we've done for me to prepare for. This is something I actually know a lot about, but I wanted to get it right and to reread. And it's a very, very complex situation. It's not a simple, it might be symbolic, but it's not at all a simple situation that occurred in South Dakota in 1890. And as I was reading, I found out that there's a Mandan, North Dakota connection, and a very interesting one. The Mandan Pioneer published an editorial in November of 1890 as this was heating up, quoting from a letter that James McLaughlin, the agent at the Standing Rock Agency, had written to his superiors. That letter was, you'll see some phrases from it in this discussion, but McLaughlin did not like Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull did not like McLaughlin. McLaughlin realized that Sitting Bull was not really a ghost dancer. And Sitting Bull was quite skeptical of the ghost dance phenomenon, but he permitted it to occur because that's the sort of leader that he was. It wasn't for him to decide whether his fellow Hunkpapa wanted to do this dance or not. But McLaughlin decided that he was going to use this incident, even though he knew Sitting Bull was only marginally attached to it. He decided to use this incident to get rid of Sitting Bull once and for all, by which he meant he would be arrested and taken at least to Omaha and perhaps farther away. And so McLaughlin was trying to stir up anti-Sitting Bull feeling amongst his superiors so that he could justify this opportunism to get rid of him. And he wrote this extraordinary letter to his superiors that was leaked probably by him to the press. And it touched off a newspaper panic all over the country about the coming outbreak in the Sioux world, in the Lakota world. This was all deeply exaggerated, first by McLaughlin and then by the newspapers. And the Mandan Pioneer jumped on board. And they used this incident, this coming crisis, to argue that Fort Abraham Lincoln should be kept open and garrisoned. There was a government plan to close Fort Lincoln, and Mandan wanted Fort Lincoln kept open for economic development chiefly, but also for security. And so they used the incident to demand that Fort Lincoln be kept open and re-garrisoned. And they spread panic rumors about what was going on that had an influence on what followed at Wounded Knee on December 29th. So most of the newspapers around the Lakota world, the Chadron Advocate and the Sturgis Weekly Record and the Aberdeen paper and the Omaha paper, played down the crisis and said, look, it's not that we trust Native Americans necessarily, but this is not going to lead to an outbreak. But the Mandan Pioneer whipped this thing up, and that account that was written on the front page in November of 1890 was reprinted all over the country and helped to fuel the national panic, which led to the incident. So North Dakota is, when I was growing up, I thought Wounded Knee was a South Dakota story, but it's not. It's a Dakota story, it's a Great Plains story, and it is also, in many important ways, a North Dakota story.
We've used a lot of terms there. Maybe we should go back, kind of go over the history, like the ghost dance and all that sort of stuff. And so let's sort of.
So here, you start. What actually happened on 29 December?
Well, if you were to cut it down to just, and again, this is really cutting it down to the very, very basics. There was a ghost dance, and we're going to talk more about that. There was a religious phenomenon that began out west and moved into this area. And the Lakota, there were a number of Lakota, and there's really variance on the estimates of how many participated. The closest thing I've seen is about 28% of the Lakota were actually participating in the ghost dance.
And at that time, there were about 10 to 12,000 Lakota people.
Yeah, so 28% are participating in the ghost dance. And the idea, and again, we're really cutting this down to bare minimums, but the idea was that there was another coming of Christ. In fact, some writers have said that the ghost dance was in fact a Christian phenomenon because it was based on Christ, on Jesus Christ. And so at any rate, and we're going to go through all of this in much more detail, so at any rate, the result was that if the Lakota people would dance this ghost dance, and that ghost dance, by the way, is the term that the whites put to it, because the idea was that they would dance to the point where they would fall into a trance, and then during that trance, then they would see those folks that had gone to heaven prior to them. And so they would meet up with ancestors, and of course for many of them it wasn't long time ago ancestors, but loved ones that they had lost. And the idea was that if they continued to do this dance, eventually the Messiah would come back, and when the Messiah came back, the Messiah would wipe out the world, this world, sort of what we call the New World. The whites would all be destroyed. The oceans would cease to allow ships to cross the ocean, and it would be a return to Indian life, and the buffalo would return, the wildlife would return, and all that. So what you had is you had this phenomenon going on, and there was some idea, you have already alluded to that there was a lot of folks that believed that in fact this was going to cause an outbreak among the Lakota, And so the government responding to all of these calls for security on the frontier, because Clay already pointed out, North Dakota and South Dakota exist. There's people in Rapid City. There's people living along the sides of the reservation. So they're whipping up this whole thing. In fact, at one point, guns are actually issued to settlers to protect them. Now, there is no evidence, and I think Clay and I will agree on this, there's no evidence that any white was ever in danger as a result of this ghost dance. If you dance long enough, the whites are going to be destroyed and the world's going to be refreshed. That's sort of the message that comes out of the ghost dance. So at any rate, Clay already mentioned McLaughlin gets involved in this. He wants to arrest Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull is shot, and there's then a real panic. And Bigfoot's people are basically racing to Pine Ridge. They get stopped by the 7th Cavalry. The next day, there's an attempt to disarm Bigfoot's Minneconjou, and a shot is fired. And at the end of that, we have what has come down to us in history is called the Wounded Knee Massacre. And the number, you've got the number 146. Nobody really knows how many. Most estimates go to about 250 Lakota were killed as a result of this. We're going to get into this much more detail, but that's sort of the basis. You want to add something there?
So this dance phenomenon, this religion, this revivalist religion, comes out of the Walker Lake, Walker River area in Nevada. It began amongst the Paiute. And this Messiah, or the spokesman for the Messiah, Wovoka, encouraged emissaries to come from all of the tribes of the American West, from tribes everywhere, to come out and to see for themselves what he was preaching. And there were two Lakota delegations went out from what's now South Dakota, all the way out to the Walker Lake area, which is south of Reno. It's out near Lake Tahoe. Went the longest distance that the Lakota had ever gone, really off the map of their known world, to meet the Messiah, Wovoka, and they were convinced that he was telling the truth, and that there was a new heaven and a new earth were coming, and that the one way to hasten this was this purification ritual in this dance. And so they brought this back, and the ghost dance phenomenon spread over the entire American West. Some tribes were more interested in it than others, and some tribes were skeptical, but the range of the ghost dance was essentially equal to the entire American West up until, say, the Mississippi River. And it led to an outbreak of an armed exchange in one place only, which is at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. So anyway, that's the bare bones of what happened. But what you're saying is that at some point, and it's on this timeline, President Harrison authorized United States Army troops to put down what was regarded as an outbreak, a dangerous outbreak in Dakota. And that's what led troops to come by railroad from Omaha and Chicago and other places, and to surround this group of native peoples who were really fleeing from the assassination of Sitting Bull. And what happened was that Bigfoot's Minneconjous, who are really Cheyenne River Indians, were wanting to surrender. Bigfoot was convinced by his own tribesmen to go towards the Badlands. There on the 28th of December, they were surrounded and stopped, and Bigfoot agreed to surrender and to come in to Pine Ridge. So effectively, that should have been the end of the issue. Over 75% of all the Lakota had already come into the agencies. A handful of recalcitrants or diehards or revelationists, whatever you want to call them, were out in the Badlands. And they too were on their way in when this incident occurred. And what apparently went wrong was that there was an attempt to do a teepee search and a body search of individuals. And that's when this shot rang out and led to this exchange. Okay. So anyway, we could go through this forever, but here, just to look at some causes of Wounded Knee. Number one, the great shrinking Sioux Reservation. We'll come back to that. But just in the previous year, George Crook had come out to convince the Sioux, the Lakota, to sell about 40% of what remained of their reservation to the United States government, the effect of which was to split the reservation into 6 island parts. And so instead of having a Great Sioux reservation, there would now be 6 individual Sioux reservations within the larger Lakota world, and they would be split by corridors. You'll see this on the maps. So that was an immediate cause. You know, going way back under the Treaty of 1851, the Lakota controlled all of the western Dakotas and part of Wyoming and part of Montana. The Treaty of 1868 created the Great Sioux Reservation, which was effectively all of western South Dakota and partly into Wyoming. After George Custer discovered gold in the Black Hills, that touched off the struggle that led to the Little Bighorn. And after the Little Bighorn, the Lakota were forced to yield the Black Hills and most of their Wyoming domain. Then in 1889, the United States government wanted more, and so they sent out a series of commissions which were rejected by the Lakota. But finally, in 1889, George Crook, who had been a great Indian fighter and had been at the Battle of the Rosebud, convinced/coerced the Lakota into yielding about 40% of what was left of their reservation. And so that was the immediate precipitating cause of this outbreak. Then at the same time, the Lakota were hungry, and the United States government arbitrarily cut the beef ration by 1/2 without consulting anybody, just decided to do it as a cost-cutting venture. So, you know, most of the historians say, Larry, that the reason there was a dance phenomenon at all is that the Lakota were starving. I mean, they were literally starving, desperate people who became susceptible to this millennial dance craze. Drought and hunger.
Could I just inject something here? It's really important, Clay, I think, for us to realize that it would be easy for us to say, well, you know, they had their reservation, you'd cut it down, just leave them alone. That was never the federal policy. The federal policy is reservations were going to go away. That eventually, and the idea behind cutting rations was really to make people hungry, to force them to start living like white settlers. And we'll just keep cutting and squeezing, and the idea is, unlike what's happened today, my view is that reservations have become homelands. The idea from the federal government's perspective was, we'll just keep squeezing them, and then, of course, we had the Allotment Act at the same time, which was going to divide up the reservation into individual plots for each one of the Indian families. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to keep squeezing down, cutting the rations as part of that strategy, taking more and more of the land as part of that strategy. So it's not just a matter of, well, let's leave them alone on the reservation. That was never the federal policy. Federal policy was reservations would be a temporary step from what was considered living in savagery to living in civilization. And they had to destroy the tribal governments, and they had to destroy tribal ownership of land. That was the federal policy. So that's what those 2 points are about.
But be that as it may, there were existing treaties with the Lakota people that were still binding under international law. And these arbitrary civilizational strategies that you're talking about were not negotiated with the sovereign nation. They were imposed from without consultation. So you have a long-term political solution in the minds of the white government in Washington. Then you have an actual situation out in the American West, and you have treaty law that's covering all of this. And as far as the Lakota were concerned, they still had a treaty that had been guaranteed to them under international law, as long as the water shall run and the grass shall grow. No one had bothered to tell them that reservations were going to be eliminated. So at least you have a communications problem, if not something much more profound going on here. But no one ever came out and said, it's our plan within a few decades to dissolve your reservation altogether. That was not something that was delivered over to the peoples being affected by this. Then just at this time, the Harrison administration came to power, and it was a Republican administration following the Cleveland administration, and so there was the spoils system was at work, and all of the agents who had been in these Lakota reservations were replaced by, except for McLaughlin, by newcomers, and most of these newcomers were political amateurs who had no interest in Indian affairs. They were just taking a plum patronage job, and the worst of them unfortunately, was at the most important of all the places, which was Pine Ridge. A man named Daniel Royer was so timid, so panicky, so uneasy with Indians that the Indians there named him White Man Afraid of the Indians, and that became his moniker through this crisis. As we've already talked about the panic of the white settlers around the Dakotas, the inexperience of the troops sent to quell the uprising. I think I just read this one, 25% were in their first month of military service. No adequate training. They'd never seen action with native peoples before. They'd been stirred up by dime novels about the perfidy and the viciousness of the Sioux. White misunderstanding of the essential pacifism and the defeatism of the ghost dance religion. But there were young Lakota individuals who were sporting for war too, and one of them helped to touch this off. I've already mentioned McLaughlin's decision to use the ghost dance in an opportunistic way to get rid of Sitting Bull. I mentioned McLaughlin's letter, which was leaked to the press, and then the sensationalism and the lies of the American press. So you probably have others that you would want to add to this, but a whole series of things created a perfect storm on the Pine Ridge in December of 1890.
The only thing I would add is, as we talk about these causes, is we need to realize how serious the United States government was taking this. The largest concentration of military force in the United States since the Civil War will be sent out to handle this alleged uprising that's going to occur. The President of the United States is directly involved in this. The Secretary of Interior, the Secretary of War. So this is really, they're taking this whole thing very, very seriously for political reasons probably. But we know that, and Clay's already alluded to, the newspaper accounts were terrible exaggerations of what was going on. And, but the federal government was taking it seriously.
And just linger on the concept of outbreak for a moment. You correct me if I'm wrong, but in the historical literature about this, there is never a single allegation that the Lakota dancers committed any crimes against white property, against white people. They didn't raid white people's cattle. The dance phenomenon may have been offensive to white government, but there were no border depredations that could legitimately be called an outbreak. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that if the Lakota had said, well, we're going to do a bunch of raiding here on white ranches and farms, you could understand some of the reaction, but there was no raiding of any sort.
Well, there was raiding, but it was Indian on Indian raiding.
Within the reservation.
Within the reservation.
Right.
There were depredations going on, as they called them, but it was depredations by, and I'm not particularly fond of these terms, with the progressive versus the non-progressive Indians. The traditionalists that were going, and we'll talk more about the stronghold and the Badlands, the traditionalists, if you will, were in fact raiding folks that were trying to set up ranching operations, but it was all within the reservation.
And only after they began to flee. So could this have been averted? Well, it's easy in hindsight to say this should never have happened and so on and so forth, but here are some, and I ask you to comment on these, Larry. Let the dance play itself out, because the ghost dance phenomenon said that the end of the world would come in the spring of 1891. So, many different groups in the history of religion have predicted the end of the world, and it's always a sort of a dicey thing to do, because when the end of the world doesn't come, that quickly creates a credibility problem for these millennial movements. It's happened over and over and over again in the history of Christianity, among other religions. So if they had let the dance phenomenon play itself out and the end of the world had not come in 1891, almost every observer said, well, they'll give up. I mean, they'll stop dancing. No one does something that's ineffective. So that would be one answer. And Valentine McGillicuddy, who's one of my heroes and who was an agent amongst the Pine Ridge, said that just let them dance it out. When the new world doesn't come, they'll all go back to their business. The second way this could have been avoided is send troops to be nearby, but keep them well away, make a perimeter so that if there is a legitimate outbreak, you're ready to go with it, but don't get attached into individual situations. And Nelson Miles, who was the 5th ranking general in the United States Army and who handled much of this, said, be on the perimeter, but don't have any don't have any interaction with Indians. Just stay on the perimeter so they see you, but don't mingle with them, because that's what's going to lead to trouble. Number 3, avoid a person-to-person search. And many people said, don't do a person-to-person search. That's a sure way to get difficulty. Number 4, when there's a crisis, you go to the experienced. And Valentine McGillicuddy had been the agent amongst the Pine Ridge Lakota for 10 years. Red Cloud and McGillicuddy had a historic struggle for mastery on that reservation, but McGillicuddy had won the respect of the native peoples. And he said, I could solve this problem in a minute, just let me go do it. And the government wouldn't let McGillicuddy do it. They had this freshman agent on board who knew nothing about the history of the Lakota, nothing about their ways, nothing about their rhetoric or their religion, their dance styles, the amount of bluff that there might have been in any given situation. And so Royer, lacking any experience in Indian affairs whatsoever, simply panicked. And almost any other agent would have done a better job. It's not coincidental that the actual bloodshed occurred where the worst agent was. Where there were better agents, things were, the lid was kept on all of this. And then, of course, number 5, feed them. If the rations, almost every historian who looks at this says if the rations hadn't been cut, there would have been no Wounded Knee. That these are starving people, and starving people do desperate things. And then finally, leave Sitting Bull out of it. I mean, McLaughlin himself said Sitting Bull was lukewarm on this phenomenon, and that he was merely using this situation to take care of something he wanted to do for other reasons. And so, if Sitting Bull hadn't been assassinated on the 15th of December, 1890, it's very unlikely that the rest would have followed. That was sort of the precipitating moment of all that then came in the next 2 weeks. So, go ahead.
Well, just to respond to a couple of these, let's talk about Royer for a minute. You know, that's the whole reason why we went to a professional federal system, because the spoils system would, when a new administration would come in, everybody that had a position, they would have to move out, and then patronage was offered to other folks. And in South Dakota, well, in any state at the time, but we're talking about South Dakota here, the governor was just given these positions to go ahead and fill. And in the case of Royer, Royer wanted one of these were all plum jobs. Royer wanted to be a federal appointee, but he wanted to be a land agent. Knew absolutely, knew nothing about the Lakota, knew nothing about Indian affairs. And so the governor, instead of making him a land agent to parcel out land through the homesteading and so forth, made him an Indian agent. Couldn't have happened at a worse time.
Or for a worse nominee.
Or a worse nominee. You know, wrong man, wrong time, wrong place.
Wrong political patronage system.
Right.
And one of the things that Theodore Roosevelt did in the response to this was to try to professionalize the Indian agents.
Yeah. The other, if I can respond to the letting it play out, that was actually Sitting Bull's recommendation. In fact, Sitting Bull sent a message to McLaughlin and said, you know, if you think this is a big concern, let's go out west and let's see if we can meet this Messiah, and let's see what happens with us. Kicking Bear had come back with these stories about meeting Wovoka and traveling to heaven and so forth. So Sitting Bull basically said to McLaughlin, okay, if you don't believe it, fine, let's go find out. And if it's not true, it's all going to end. And so letting it play out would have been, again, in hindsight for us, that would have been the best thing to do. The other thing that plays out here with the troops is that there's a lot of tension between the Department of Interior and the Department of War. And this is purely a political struggle. And the War Department wants to take over Indian affairs and has since 1849, when the Interior Department was created and Indian Affairs, the Commission of Indian Affairs was put under the Interior Department. The War Department always figured that this was their responsibility. And so there's really some political motives for the War Department to amass troops and to send the troops out to demonstrate the fact that the Interior Department cannot control their subjugated Indians, if you will, and that it's going to take the military. So the military responds to this in many ways, and Nelson Miles moves his headquarters from Chicago to Rapid City as a result of this whole incident, and probably for political reasons as well.
So let's just summarize here. A religious phenomenon emerges from the Great Basin, from Nevada, and it becomes a sort of a pan-Indian religion with a lot of millennial elements that come actually out of Christianity. So it's sort of a mix of things, but it's an end-of-the-world dream followed by a new golden age. And in the new golden age, all the buffalo will be back, and all the Indians who ever lived would be back, and the Indian lifeway would be back, and white people would be gone. And this phenomenon then radiates around the American West. The Lakota take a special interest in it and send out not one but two huge, complex missions to go find out about it. And Kicking Bear and Short Bull and others come back convinced that this is true. They are convinced that this is the Messiah. They have met Wovoka, and they have no doubt that this is the answer. And then Kicking Bull becomes, he's a Minneconjou, he becomes a sort of apostle of the ghost dance religion in the Lakota world. And for some reason, this dance religious millennial phenomenon pursued by a desperate and hungry people whose land is being stripped from them, but who have committed no depredations of any sort to the surrounding white community. That phenomenon becomes an outbreak and enables the United States government to send the largest contingent of troops since the Civil War to concentrate in one place for a group of people who are dancing and have not committed a single crime against white property. So can you try to explain how that could happen?
Thank you, Clay.
Well, it does. I mean, when you put it in those terms, it's sort of hard to figure, isn't it?
It is. It is. You know, as we've been getting ready for this and I've been reading about this, I think the only way for us in 2010 to understand this, now there's a lot of things here that we can't understand, and there's a lot of things that don't make sense. But when you think about the sort of I guess there's a whipped up fear from the white settlers, and then that ends up as the government feeling like it's got to respond to all these fears. Because, think about the bomber on Christmas Day. Had this bomber been successful, what would we as citizens of the United States be saying about our federal government? And that kind of helps me understand how the federal government was responding to the white settlers out here saying, just a minute, now you've got a responsibility to protect us, and we just know that the Lakota are planning to wage war against us, so you've got to protect us. And so we end up with this kind of response to it. But I think about, in our very recent history, the Iraqi war, how weapons of mass destruction became the thing that, Americans were rallying around the weapons of mass destruction. The president told us they were in there, and so we went in there, and I'm not trying to get political or anything, but if you can kind of feel like how most Americans thought that was the right thing to do was to go into Iraq, and I don't know if most Americans would say that today. Vietnam's the same thing. So I guess there are analogies in more modern history where we can understand where the government's responding to something based on the fact that there's real fear about something. So there's no good answer to the question you asked.
But we've had these long conversations about this today, and you've said, and I respect what you're saying, that it's easy in hindsight to say, well, it was a harmless dance, but that's not how the people of the Dakotas, the white people of the Dakotas took it. That's not how some members of the military took it, and it's in the end not how President Harrison took it. They regarded this as I think Miles said, and Miles was he was a famous Indian fighter. Miles City, Montana is named after him. He was the person who arrested Chief Joseph up near the Canadian border, and he had won some respect from the native peoples that he had been around. And Miles said, well, it probably won't be an outbreak, but if it is, the Lakota are better armed than they have ever been at any time in their history. They had repeating Winchesters, and the Army was using single-shot rifles in this struggle. And he said they're more widely armed than they've ever been, and the fact of the white settlement around the reservations means that if they go off-res and start to do raids, there are plenty of cattle, there's a lot of flour, there's a lot of food, there's a lot of wood, there are horses, that the situation around the reservation is such that they could resupply themselves much more easily than they could have 30 years ago. So, I mean, Miles is not an idiot. He's not trying to whip this into a crisis. He's saying, I think we can keep the lid on this, but if it comes off, if there are 10,000 Lakota and they can put 5,000 warriors into the field, that's going to be a major frontier event, and we can't allow it to happen. Does that make sense?
You bet.
So let's just move on. So this is a really interesting map. This is Indian country today. And Larry, look at the concentration of native peoples. You know, virtually no concentration east of the Mississippi River except in a few patches. Huge concentration in Arizona, New Mexico, and a lot in Montana and the Dakotas, particularly South Dakota. But that tells you a lot about, and one reason to do a program like this is about how few conversations really occur about white Indian relations in the American West today. This is a conversation we have to have. This concentration reminds us that the struggle between whites and Indians is not over. It's not an armed struggle very often anymore, but there are still huge issues of sovereignty, of land restoration, of the flooding of the dams, of Indian gaming, Indian jurisdiction for crime and punishment, and licensing of Indian activity on reservations, checkerboarding, etc. It's one of the mistakes of letting Wounded Knee become too symbolic is that it's regarded as the end of the struggle. It was the end of the struggle in one sort, but that struggle continues into our own time. That's the Sioux world, the Lakota world there in the blue, red, yellow. But this is an even better map to tell us why this happened. If you want to take sort of a really big lens on this, Larry, here's a map of the Euro-American settlement of North America in 1850. And notice that North Dakota is entirely untouched under that in 1850. That the end here of this pink is sort of the frontier line in 1850. And because the frontier line had come here, and because of the Oregon Trail, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was signed, essentially establishing the large boundaries of native territories in the American West. So then look at this, in 40 years, that's 1850, here's 1890. Look what's happened. Now suddenly, the frontier has moved to, that's around Jamestown. It's come all the way to Pierre in South Dakota. I got an inset map here, but this is part of why this struggle occurred. Look at what the Dakotas looked like in 1890. And so back in 1868, when the Great Sioux Reservation was created, white people thought, well, it'll be a long time, if ever, before we want that land. By 1890, they very much wanted that land. And so they wanted to break up the Great Sioux Reservation so that it could be deeded out to white people, so they could divide and conquer Indian resistance, so that there could be transportation corridors to the Black Hills through what was formerly the reservation. But the white encroachment onto Indian sovereignty is what touched off the series of last struggles.
I think it's significant to point out in 1890 as well as when the federal government would declare the frontier is over.
Closed, yeah.
It's closed. Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893 will give that famous address.
So here's what happened to the reservation. In 1851, the Lakota claimed at the Fort Laramie Treaty a huge territory. They didn't have specific boundaries in mind, but a huge territory. And that treaty attempted to delineate those boundaries for the first time. In 1868, we got what's today known as the Great Sioux Reservation. That's this purple, going all the way out to the Wyoming-Montana border. And under the 1868 treaty, the Lakota were granted substantial hunting and wandering rights in what's now eastern Wyoming and southeastern Montana. Then, because of Custer's discovery of gold in the Black Hills, this section, this is what precipitated the Little Bighorn. This section in far western 50-mile stretch plus a tongue going into the Belle Fourche Cheyenne Basin, this was taken from the Lakota people in 1877 as a punishment for the catastrophe at the Little Bighorn. And so that meant the reservation was all the way to this line and over here and down. Then in 1889, this section was taken really by the white government from the Lakota Nation. That split the reservation into these 6 pieces. And then in the 1890s, you had this checkerboarding, which essentially absorbed much of the reservations down in the Pine Ridge and Rosebud area. So, you know, from the point of view of the Lakota people, beginning around 1851, it has been just one land cession followed by land grab and conquest, followed by coerced land deal after the next, until they were marooned on these island reservations. And so this part of what's going on here is a last sense of outrage, a last armed sense of outrage against the series of land cessions. And this is where the Lakota came from originally. That's the ethnic distribution, more or less, of the Lakota people. And there again is the reservation system as it existed at the dawn of Wounded Knee. So let's just skip out of that for a moment. I mean, that's a pretty cursory way of saying, here are some causes of what happened. Here's the catalyst, Wovoka. Wovoka was a Paiute. He had this vision on January 1st, 1888. His father had also been a medicine man and had a similar but somewhat more vague vision of a new heavens and a new earth. Wovoka had been raised by white people. His white name was Jack Wilson. He had considerable interaction with Mormons and considerable interaction with non-Mormon Christians.
Shakers.
And Shakers, and a lot of his vision is regarded by anthropologists as a kind of cultural amalgam of traditional Native American religion, Paiute style, Mormonism, frontier Protestantism, Shakerism, and a few other pieces.
I'm going to stop here for just a second to point at the dates here. Wovoka died in 1932. I know there's people in this room that were alive in 1932. Shyla raised her hand. We've got Deweybeard here, and we'll be talking a little bit about Deweybeard. Deweybeard was both at the Little Bighorn and at Wounded Knee, and he dies in 1956. So when we're talking about this, it's not ancient history. Many of us in this room were around in 1956. Did I say 18 on him? 1956, okay.
Yeah.
So Deweybeard died in 1956, lived an incredible century from 1858 to 1956.
His Lakota name was Iron Hale. Yeah. I mean, he took the name Deweybeard later in life. But one thing to keep in mind about Wovoka is that he had no idea that this thing that he was doing was going to touch off a catastrophe somewhere. And he was a pacifist. And he said, we have a great deal of documentation of what Wovoka said and did. I lived in Nevada for a time, and I spent some time studying Wovoka and going out to where he's buried. You'll see a picture of that in a minute. But he was a man of peace. He said, tell all the people they must not fight, that there must be peace all over the world, the people must not steal from one another, but be good to each other, for they are all brothers. You can hear some Christianity in that. Not that that's exclusive to Christianity, but you can hear things almost out of Matthew in this. And he said, do your jobs, don't go off reservation. When white people say things to you, obey them. He was a non-militant right to the core. And the Ghost Dance, the militant side of the Ghost Dance did not come from him. It came from adaptations made as it traveled out from Walker Lake in Nevada. And by all accounts, every historian says the same thing, that the most militant application of the Ghost Dance came in Lakota country, thanks to Kicking Bear and Short Bull, who both, their reading of the vision was a more militaristic one than apparently what Wovoka was saying. Here's his grave in central Nevada, west central Nevada. And these are ghost shirts. The ghost shirt was not Wovoka's idea. There's a lot of controversy about where the ghost shirt came from, but it's almost certainly an Arapaho and Lakota idea. Black Elk, in Black Elk Speaks, claims that he made the first ghost shirt and that he had a vision of the ghost shirt. But Kicking Bear is usually regarded as the apostle of Wovoka to the Lakota and the one who created the ghost shirt idea. Ghost shirts do two things. One is that they're, and now we're really getting into ground where we have no business, but ghost shirts are a form of clothing that incorporates sacred symbols and creates a sense of the sacred about it. So in other words, that it's not just decoration. the things that go on the ghost shirt are meant somehow to invoke and to imbue medicine or spirit. And according to Kicking Bear, the ghost shirt, if it were properly worn by a dancer who was pure and purified and doing the dance right, the ghost shirt would be a protective shield that would make that person impenetrable to bullets. And so a lot of what happened is a confusion, apparently, about the medicine of a ghost shirt. But I have a few here. They're extraordinarily beautiful. That's a woman's shirt. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the symbology of it. I think it's probably not a good idea since it's not our religious sensibility, but a lot of these shirts exist. They were frequently done on muslin, not as often on hide. Here are three beautiful shirts. The moon was on many of them, the sun on some, the spotted eagle, the crow. You see the handprints on these, streaks of lightning, blue for the sky. Anyway, so this religious phenomenon begins in Nevada. It spreads around the country. Different tribes move it in different directions. The Lakota militarize it to a certain extent. Kicking Bear apparently invents or has a vision that leads him to create the ghost shirt phenomenon. What would you say?
Well, I think at this point, now I'm just reading your slide there, we're going to move on to Sitting Bull, because at this point, all of this stuff that we've sort of laid out here now comes to the point at Sitting Bull's cabin, where we've got progressive versus non-progressive, or traditionalists versus simulationists, whatever you want to say. The police get involved in this now, and so I just think we ought to go through this.
But I guess the only thing I would say about this is that you know, non-native peoples have very little understanding of what was really going on here. Mm-hmm. James Mooney was sent out by the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology to do a report on this, and he wrote a stunningly interesting report that was published in 1891. But there are people who spend their lives examining the ghost dance, and they're a lot more skeptical about anything we might conclude about it than we could be. So I think the thing to keep in mind is that white people didn't understand it, maybe don't understand it, but they misunderstood it then as somehow being dangerous, that it wasn't something that was a religious expression of native peoples that was of no consequence. They regarded it as potentially of great consequence to the white settlements of the Dakotas and Montana.
You know, something I think we probably ought to say, and I guess we haven't said yet, is that this idea of the ghost dance and the return to Indian ways and the prescription not to use, for example, ghost dance, again, we have no right going in here, but you weren't supposed to put metal on them because that metal was something that was a product from the whites, and so metal shouldn't go on them. We can go back in Indian history, Handsome Lake of the Iroquois, the Shawnee Prophet. Many of the messages that were around the ghost dance and the renewal of the earth and the destruction, although that's probably the wrong term to use, of the whites that were there, but the return, the revitalization of the native cultures. We see that going on a lot as white civilization is on the march going west. That folks, that native people that are desperate and feeling desperate, there are a number of examples of prophets, if you will, messengers that will come forward and say, if you just renounce the white ways, and eventually then the white ways will disappear and there will be a renewal of Indian culture. So Wovoka and the ghost dance is just another one of those, not just another, that's probably a bad term.
But there were these attempts to purify native culture from the industrial encroachments of white civilization. And so many things that, had already been widely adopted by native peoples were rejected for the ghost shirts and for the ghost ceremonies because they were white people's events. So then Sitting Bull, I mean, I don't want to go into a lot of talk about Sitting Bull because that in itself is a huge and endless discussion of what actually happened on the 15th of December. But this much we know. McLaughlin wanted him arrested. He tried several times during the year to get authorization to arrest him. Finally, he received that authorization on the 12th of December, and he decided to wait to arrest and deport Sitting Bull for a couple of weeks, hoping that cold weather would come and that would kind of put a dampening effect on the ghost dance phenomenon at Sitting Bull's camp on the Grand River. But then he learned he had a spy network that worked back and forth. There was heavy factionalism amongst the Native Americans at Standing Rock, and he learned that Sitting Bull had received an invitation from the ghost dancers at Pine Ridge to come down there, and that he was preparing to go down for an extended stay. He was not technically allowed to leave the reservation without permission of James McLaughlin. Sitting Bull sent a note to James McLaughlin saying, "I'm going to be leaving the reservation here shortly, just wanted you to know." And McLaughlin decided he had to do it now because if Sitting Bull got away, he'd lose control of the situation. So he sent out an army detail of cavalry to be nearby, but he sent out about 40 Indian policemen to go arrest Sitting Bull at dawn on the 15th of December, 1890. And it's a fascinating story, but Sitting Bull was eventually goaded into resisting, and a fight broke out, and a number of Indian police were killed, and a number of Sitting Bull's family and cohorts were killed, but he was killed on the 15th of December, 1890. And it's interesting, but it's fascinating, but it's only interesting to this discussion for what it precipitated. Because as I said, Sitting Bull was very lukewarm about the ghost dance. But there's David Humphreys Miller is the artist whose paintings are in the lobby, and you'll see a little bit more of today. This is his drawing of Sitting Bull. This is, of course, a famous painting, or a famous photograph. This is where Sitting Bull's cabin was, right here. And this is where this occurred at dawn on the 15th of December, 1890. This group of Indian police had been sent out from Fort Yates and Standing Rock. They stayed at Bullhead's house. Bullhead was an enemy to Sitting Bull, and he provided shelter on the night before this occurred. But here's what's interesting. This is this famous letter that McLaughlin wrote that stirred everything up. Now keep in mind, Sitting Bull is in his 50s. He's a nuisance to McLaughlin, but he has not done any overt act of any sort, and he has shown a very skeptical view of the ghost dance. But here's what McLaughlin said. It's in 3 slides. Sitting Bull is a high priest and leading apostle of this latest Indian absurdity. That's not true. In a word, he is the chief mischief maker at this agency, and if he were not here, this craze, so general amongst the Sioux, would never have gotten a foothold at this agency. Sitting Bull is a man of low cunning, devoid of a single manly principle in his nature or an honorable trait in his character, but on the contrary is capable of instigating and inciting others, those who believe in his powers, to do any amount of mischief. I mean, he's more or less making this up. He goes on, he is an Indian unworthy of notice except as a disaffected intriguer who grasps every opportunity to maintain his power and popularity. He is opposed to everything of an elevating nature and is the most vain, pompous, and untruthful Indian that I ever knew. His word is not believed by the more intelligent Indians of this agency, but is the idol of the disaffected and the worthless element of the Sioux. He is such an abject coward that he will not commit any overt act himself, thus acknowledging that Sitting Bull has done nothing worthy of arrest, but does this intriguing and directs his mischief to be done by his less cunning followers. Sitting Bull is a polygamist, libertine, habitual liar, active obstructionist, and a great obstacle in the civilization of these people, and he's so devoid of any of the nobler traits of character and so devoted to the old Indian ways and superstitions that it is very doubtful if any change for the better will ever come over him at his present age of 56 years. He has been a disturbing element here since his return from confinement as a military prisoner in the spring of 1883 and has grown steadily worse this past year. I would respectfully recommend the removal from the reservation and confinement in some military prison some distance from the Sioux country of Sitting Bull, and then he named some others. That letter, Larry, is a strongly worded letter by a man who had an enormous amount of credibility, James McLaughlin. He's one who was so well regarded that he survived these spoil system patronage moves. He writes this letter knowing that Sitting Bull is not a ghost dancer at heart. On the October 17th, then the letter is leaked, and that's the letter that touched off the national sense that there was going to be an outbreak of the Sioux, led by the famous Sitting Bull, who was now an active fomenter of this ghost dance phenomenon. What do you make of that?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the arrest, and I don't know what your next slide is here. Where are we going?
It's just, this is Sitting Bull's monument now.
Oh, okay. Part of what precipitates the arrest at the time, too, is that McLaughlin's trying to ensure that the military does not make the arrest. Secretary of Interior Noble has sent word out to all the agents that they will obey the military commander in the area, that they will basically take their orders from the military commander. McLaughlin rails against that. He wants to do it. He wants to do it with his Indian police. He doesn't want the military involved. Buffalo Bill has been sent out by General Miles to actually convince Sitting Bull to turn himself in, and so he's got to do everything he can to prevent Buffalo Bill from getting involved in this, which includes getting him to the officers club and having him drink all night long, just so he doesn't ride out to see Sitting Bull. So McLaughlin really, I think, at this point in time feels like if he's going to maintain control, and I'm not talking about control of the situation, he wants to maintain control of the politics of being an Indian agent there. He wants to stay in charge, and so he has to act, and act quickly, or the military will act.
And McLaughlin did not send out that arrest posse to kill Sitting Bull. It just happened. But he was certainly using this opportunity to get rid of somebody who, as he says, he's an intriguer and cunning and blah, blah, blah. But what another, if you wear a different lens, you'd say he's a traditionalist who is actively resisting the forced assimilation of native peoples into white culture. But McLaughlin didn't like that, and he regarded Sitting Bull as having enormous influence, which is in part true. And so he thought, we'll get rid of him and arrest him and take him to a military prison. Everything goes wrong on that morning, and that's a catastrophe that occurred that has two consequences. It's still an issue in Indian country today, and once this happened, Sitting Bull's followers, most of them fled from the Standing Rock to the Badlands. So they fled down to the very area where this happened, and it was pursuing, that's what the national press regarded as the outbreak, that now there were Indians off reservation heading to join the rest of the ghost dancers in the Badlands of what's now South Dakota. They would not have fled, of course, if Sitting Bull hadn't been shot that morning. If he had just been left alone, as he himself said, leave us alone and it'll either be true or it won't, they would not have gone off reservation. There wouldn't have been this national encirclement. So this is at McLaughlin. Okay, so Wounded Knee. We're going to run out of time before we ever get very far with this, but as you're probably sensing.
We normally do here, yeah.
But on May 29th, 1890, the first white civilian contacted the national government of the United States, Charles Hyde in South Dakota, and he said that he'd been made aware that there was an outbreak coming, and that's what really got the attention of the national government and set in motion a chain of events which led to Wounded Knee. Royer, who we won't spend time on this, but Royer was completely hysterical in his dispatches, his telegrams to the national government. Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy. I love that.
And if I can on this point, Royer, again, man afraid of his Indians, as he was called, when the other agents were asked, well, how many leaders would have to be arrested on your reservation in order to stop this whole ghost dance phenomena? And the other agents respond, McLaughlin, I said, Sitting Bull and maybe 5 others. And at the other reservations, they're saying, well, maybe 10 or 15, and we can stop the whole thing. It gets to Royer, and he says 70, and that won't even be a good start. He just wants to round up everybody that's involved in the ghost dance, absolutely incompetent.
So when this is all beginning to get national attention, the War Department sent out, and the Interior sent out queries to all of the reservations saying, well, tell us what's going on out there. And just look at this. These are the reports from, here's from Cheyenne River, the home of Kicking Bear and also of Hump and also of Bigfoot. Agent McChesney says, so far as the Indians of China agency are concerned, I speak with some confidence and do not hesitate to say no fears need be entertained. Gallagher at Pine Ridge, who is soon replaced by Daniel Royer, says no ground for apprehension. I have the assurance of the Indian police that all parts of the reserve, the Indians are peaceful. George Wright at the Rosebud, the idea of an outbreak is scoffed at. McLaughlin, insofar as the Indians of this agency are concerned, there's nothing either in their words or actions that would justify such a rumor. Here's what Valentine McGillicuddy said. He was the former agent to the Red Cloud Agency, and I think he has the most sensible single response to the whole thing. I should let the dance continue. The coming of the troops has frightened the Indians. If the Seventh-day Adventists got up on their roofs to welcome the second coming, the whole U.S. Army is not rushed into motion to prevent them. Why should the Indians not have the same privilege? If the troops remain, trouble is sure to come. When you look back at this from 100 years later, Larry, you think, why didn't everyone just say this? He had been with the Lakota for 10 long years. His credentials are enormous. He was called Wasichu Wakan by the Lakota, white medicine man. There's a monument to him on Harney Peak at the top of it, the highest point in the Black Hills. He was like the Forrest Gump of this era. He was with Custer in 1874 in the Black Hills. He was with Crook on the Hunger March to the Black Hills. He was the presiding physician at the death of Crazy Horse in September of 1877 at Fort Robinson. He was everywhere during this period, and he built up an enormous amount of understanding of Native peoples and credibility. That's not that they always liked what he did, but they respected who he was. And he said, duh, let them dance. They'll dance themselves out. And he offered, he was by now, he was an entrepreneur in Rapid City. He was out of the government service, and he said, I'll go down there, and I can settle this thing down overnight if you'll let me. And the government, between the Interior Department and the War Department, said no thanks. But from retrospect, it's hard not to see that he was entirely right, don't you think?
Yeah. Well, in retrospect, it's easy to see. But at the time, and not to be repeating ourselves here, but at the time, you consider what the federal government's in a position where they are concerned about an outbreak. And what they're really concerned about is the white settlers in that area that are really fomenting this, and we know what the news reports were saying. But
okay, let me go. Here's some photographs I took over Christmas at Wounded Knee. I'll just quickly go through these. It's an extraordinary place to visit. This is where the troops were stationed. The Native peoples were placed here when they surrendered on the 28th of December. This is the gulch, or the coulee, the ravine that was used as an escape route by those who survived the initial volley. This is the cemetery. Up on this cemetery hill, it's also known as the Hotchkiss Gun Hill. This is where the Hotchkiss guns, this ordnance was placed. It's not a very high hill, but they had a good view down into the valley.
if I can, Hotchkiss is an artillery, and it shot 50 shells a minute, exploding shells.
They're 10 pounds, and they're 1 7/8 in diameter, so they were pretty significant shells. They shelled the village once they started. There's the church. This is up on Cemetery Hill, where the guns were. This is looking down from Cemetery Hill at the battle site. This was just about 3 weeks ago. It's one of those, you talked about cultural DNA, you know, there are a handful of places where you go in the American West where you just feel something. Even if you don't really know what you're feeling, you feel something happening. The Little Bighorn is one of those places. Bear Butte is one of those places. This is one of those places. You get out of your car and you're just a little uneasy because of there's an energy there that just comes, you see that sign, and then it just begins to, and it's hard to explain, but there's a spirited place there that you felt at Little Bighorn and other places of that sort. There's the monument on top of Cemetery Hill. And then, so anyway, that's Wounded Knee. Let's go to the newspaper war for just a minute. Because of that October 17th letter that McLaughlin wrote and leaked to the press, the newspapers went nuts over this all around the country. And this is the Chicago Tribune. This is based entirely, they paraphrase most of McLaughlin's letter in the story that follows. But here's their headline: to wipe out the whites. What the Indians expect of the coming Messiah, fears of an outbreak. And then this woman is Catherine Weldon, who was Woman Walks Ahead. She was the woman from New York who spent time out here trying to work on behalf of the rights of the Lakota at Standing Rock. Here's the Chicago Tribune. For the last 4 weeks, Sitting Bull has been inviting the Sioux Indians in his vicinity to an uprising. He enlisted the sympathy of a large number of young bucks by telling them the story of his great bravery on the field of the Custer Massacre. But now Larry, look at, this is the Sturgis, South Dakota. We don't normally think of Sturgis, South Dakota as a place of a calming influence on anything. But here's what the Sturgis Daily Record wrote about these newspapermen who were coming in from Chicago and New York and Boston and Philadelphia. Isn't it about time that some of these wild and woolly newspaper liars be spanked and sent out of harm's way? There never was any danger of an Indian outbreak, and none exists now unless these silly, sensational reports have scared people into acts. It would pay the Immigration Department of South Dakota to lynch the majority of these liars and stand the expense. This ghost dance has been worked up into a very wonderful and exciting matter by pin-headed war correspondents and other irresponsible parties until they have succeeded in massing nearly half the United States Army to be spectators to an Indian powwow. That's a good one. The Sturgis records of the ghost dance has been worked up into a wonderful and exciting matter. It's just the same thing. But now look across the state. When I read this the other day, and I apologize for how awful this is, but look at this. This is by the author of The Wizard of Oz writing that same Christmas. I'm not going to read it because it's so awful. You can read it, but and he's arguing for complete genocide of the native peoples of the Dakotas. A pretty chilling thing. So here's the site. The hill where the Hotchkiss guns were. This is the gulch that you saw, the ravine. Here's the creek. Once the firing began, the women and children tried to escape to the west up this gulch. This is where the Army had stationed itself. Forsyth was court-martialed. There was a court of inquiry about Forsyth after this, because of and Nelson Miles was upset by the carnage of the thing. So he was trying to protect his own reputation because he'd been the officer in charge of the whole operation. And so he had Forsyth, not court-martialed, but court of inquiry, and Forsyth was exonerated. But one thing that the inquiry came to, Larry, was that, and this is a really important point, that he had stationed his troops badly for this situation. That once the firing began, the Army was firing at itself across, the Army had been stationed in such a way that there was friendly fire. And he said, and so this was used as proof that they had not come there to massacre Indians. They had come there to surround and disarm Indians, and if they had intended a genocidal event, they would not have stationed their own troops in such a way that there would be this sort of crossfire. And so almost every historian says what happened that day was a horrible thing that happened, but it wasn't a deliberate attempt to kill Indian soldiers, women, and children at that site. Isn't that your sense of it? Well,
that would be true up until the firing started. I think, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think when the military showed up there was no doubt in the military's mind, and keeping in mind that many of the enlisted guys, as you've already pointed out, were green troops. Now, some of the officers were very senior troops, senior officers. But I don't think that anybody showed up on that day, that morning, to have what happened happen. But I think once the firing started, what we call military discipline completely broke down. And the inquiries later on, the officer said, we tried to stop our troops, and we couldn't. And so when you've got a bunch of guys out there with a lot of firepower, the artillery and the rest of the weapons that they had, and it just turned into
A killing field at that point.
a bloodbath killing field. But I will say I don't think that on that morning when the sun came up on December 29th, that was anyone's intention that that would happen. That doesn't exonerate it by any means. It's just there are, we were talking the other night, and the term that you came up with was panic.
A panic massacre.
A panic massacre. That what happened was when panic set in, it turned out to be what it was. And you can't...
As opposed to, say, My Lai, where there was a decision to go in and burn that village.
Right. Or Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, where the Colorado Volunteers went down with the purpose of destroying an entire village. That's why they went there. The volunteers, in fact, posted sentries around Fort Lyons, where the Army was, so that the Army would not respond to help or to notify the Indians that they were on their way. So the volunteers surrounded the post, and then they went out and attacked the village. They did that deliberately.
In order to kill.
In order to kill. In order to kill and to destroy the village. That happens in this case. I just don't think when the sun came up that was the intent.
The intent to disarm the remnant who are still in the stronghold and now at Wounded Knee, to move them to the Pine Ridge Agency, to feed them, to escort them back to their individual reservations, and to forbid the ghost dance. That was the plan. And where it went wrong, two things happened. One was a terrible strategic mistake, which was to do a person-by-person search. They did it because they knew that Indians were hiding rifles under their blankets. But to do a person-by-person search under such circumstances it might have been smarter just to say, well, a few rifles are going to get hidden, but we've gotten most of them. The second thing that happened was, now we go to the Native American side, there were 2 Indians present who stirred things up rather than ratcheted them down. One was Yellow Bird, who was a medicine man, and while he's seen in the painting, we'll come back to if we can find it. He's the painting we began with, but he was picking up dirt and throwing it defiantly and calling upon his fellow native peoples, his fellow Lakota, to resist. And then, according to almost every account, there was a man named Black Coyote who was being asked to release his rifle, and he said, I'm not giving up this rifle. It's good, it's new, I paid good money for it. If you want it, you have to buy it. And they were trying to jump him to take that rifle away when it went off. It didn't kill anyone. It went off harmlessly into the air, but when it went off, that's when everybody started shooting and fighting. So those two native peoples, what happened was that, and I'm sure this is an area that you and I don't understand, but after the carnage was over, another native leader went over to Yellow Bird's corpse. He was killed, and he made an obscene gesture or an angry gesture and said, this is the man who caused this today, because he felt that Yellow Bird had stirred this thing up until the pot blew. At any rate, there was internal factionalism, and something went wrong. But when it went wrong, I think you agree, there was a complete breakdown of military discipline by the White Army, and they went into a genocidal riot, essentially. Is that fair?
Yeah. Why don't we go through the pictures? What I'd like to do is for us to stop talking, I know, and start getting, getting some responses.
There's a Hotchkiss gun right there, by the way.
And start getting some responses from the audience. As we talk about this and try to describe it again, and Clay has said this, sometimes we get into areas we have no business going into, and this may be one of them, but we want to be sensitive to the folks here that may want to respond to the things that we've said already.
Can I just say one thing before we do that? Every year there is a memorial ride that starts at Sitting Bull's camp on the 15th of December, which is the anniversary of his martyrdom. And it's a horse ride that goes all the way through the trail that the Hunkpapa took to the stronghold and eventually to Wounded Knee. And it begins on the 15th of December, and it culminates on the 29th of December. The 15th when Sitting Bull was cut down, and the 29th when the massacre occurred. And there's a beautiful coffee table book of photographs about this that I have. Just brought in a couple, but this is reenacted, if that's not too cheap a term. This is memorialized every year during that 2-week period. And here, this is coming down Bigfoot Pass. This is a cross-country 2-week horse caravan of people who are showing respect for what occurred after the death of Sitting Bull by riding from essentially Fort Yates to Wounded Knee. And isn't that something? I mean, just imagine today the weather outside, or the Christmas blizzard, which would have been right in the heart of this. So this is pretty amazing to think, you know, it's one thing for someone like me to dress up in tights and pretend to be Thomas Jefferson. There's not much sacrifice there. I mean, imagine going for 2 weeks on this ride to show respect for what you're calling the searing fortnight in the history of the Great Plains. All right, go ahead.
Well, do you want to, maybe we should just kind of wrap this up, go through Miller very quickly, and then we'll open it up for questions. Just a couple of things of note. After Wounded Knee, or at Wounded Knee, at Pine Ridge, is Dr. Charles Eastman, who was himself Native American. He was trained in Dartmouth and Boston.
Brown, eventually. Well, anyway, he was trained in the East.
Trained in the East. Got a job with the Indian Service 2 months before this incident happened. At any rate, so wounded are brought back to Pine Ridge, and then there's a no-kidding running battle now that will occur. For understandable reasons, Lakotas that are back at Pine Ridge, and they hear the firing, and they end up, and so there's sporadic fighting that will go on from that day until the 15th of January, I think it is, when it's over. And that really ends that whole terrible episode. Is on the 15th of January in 1891. So I don't know what else to say.
Well, just then now there's, this is really a hard conversation to have, and it's painful too, because we're talking about something that's still a very raw incident. Yes. And the recent, you make the point of how recent this is in the history of the Great Plains, and its after effects are still being absorbed today. We are fortunate, on the other hand, because thanks to our friendship with Randy Hudson-Buehler and Shyla Schaefer, we have access to paintings by a man named David Humphreys Miller. David Humphreys Miller, you'll see his paintings out in the lobby. We have 2 of them here, and I'm going to show you a few more. But David Humphreys Miller was a white anthropologist and artist who became fascinated at the age of 16 with Lakota culture. He was interested, not just Lakota culture, and also the Battle of the Little Bighorn. His parents, he lived in Ohio, and his parents let him go out at the age of 16 in 1935 to the Great Plains, and he spent much of the rest of his life searching for the survivors of the Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee and interviewing them. He learned 14 Indian languages, beginning with Lakota. Think of that. He learned 14 Indian languages, beginning with Lakota. He interviewed as many of the survivors as he could possibly find. He painted those who were willing to be painted. And he left behind hundreds of sketches, drawings, formal illustrations and paintings of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Lakota, etc. Here he is. And some of you probably know this story, but the late, great Harold Schaefer played a small role in the film How the West Was Won. And on set, he met David Humphreys Miller, who was the historian advisor to that film. And Harold did a herald on him and said, why don't you come help me set up a museum in North Dakota? And David Humphreys Miller dedicated a portion of his life to helping to create the Harold and Shyla Schaefer Native American collection, which for a long time was on display out in Medora. Is not at the moment, it's in storage, but thanks to Shyla, 8 of those paintings have been made available to you. Just say where they are now.
Well, we've got them in the gallery. One of them is here, there's Crow Dog on the left, my left, your right. There, by the way, the power of technology here, we put on our website that we were having this conversation, that we were going to show these, have on at the gallery out here, the David Humphreys Miller. The eight
leaders that they have in their collection here.
And so out of the blue, I got a call from a guy who had his Google alert set up and found this out, and a guy by the name of Brent Stevens, who's a collector of David Humphreys Miller. And so he lent us some for the showing as well, and we really appreciate that.
We have 7 of his paintings, 5 on display, and then 8 of Shyla's and Randy's paintings that are part of the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation's collection, which also includes medicine bundles and shields and artifacts and bows and arrows and headdresses and a lot of things, not all of which were David Humphreys Miller, but he was a collector of artifacts in addition to being a painter. He wrote 2 books. Here's one, Custer's Fall, The Inside Side of the Story, 1957, and more famously, Ghost Dance, 1959. Here he is painting, and this is his house in Southern California. Eventually he had 72 paintings of the survivors. He found all 72 survivors of one or both of those events and painted everyone who was willing to be painted. Eventually he had a gallery of 72. Here he is with his wife Jan, and you can see the 72 in the mirror in the background. So I talked to this wonderful man, Brent Stevens, who's this collector, and he's writing a book on David Humphreys Miller. 2 things about this. Number one, he was gracious enough to send us a whole series of things, including these 7 paintings, 5 of which are displayed. But he also said that that David Humphreys Miller's paintings number into the hundreds, plus artifacts, and they are all now being represented by a San Francisco auctioneer. And the estimated value of the collection, the sale value of the collection, is $1.5 million. And so I said to him on the phone, you set it up, I talked to him on the phone actually I was in Mexico, and I said to him, what do you think should happen to this collection? And he said, well, a lot of people are interested in it, but they want to break it up. He said, that's not what should happen. And so I said, what should happen? He said, this collection is a world-class collection by a very extraordinary man, who was a great painter in addition to being a serious anthropologist and historian, who won the respect of the Great Plains native peoples. He said, this collection belongs in the Dakotas. And all I could think of was if Harold were still alive, he'd be on a plane, and he'd bring in a U-Haul and haul them back to North Dakota. $1.5 million is a lot of money, but it's not out of the question that it would be possible for this collection to wind up in Medora, North Dakota. Wouldn't that be something?
Should we pass the hat here this afternoon?
So let me just go forward and show you a few. He painted everything. This is part of his Stagecoach series. This is called To Telluride. This is Yellow Bird. This is called The Proud Ones. This is Dewey Beard, so this is the same Dewey Beard as you have in front of you here. This is, it's a different painting at a different time. He painted him, I think, 8 or 9 times over a period of time. Look at the face. Here's John Sitting Bull, the deaf-mute adopted son, I believe, of the famous Sitting Bull. It's a very extraordinary painting, I think. This is the Cheyenne Autumn Story. He was an advisor on 25 Hollywood films, one of which was How the West Was Won. That's how he met Harold Schaefer. But he also advised for Cheyenne Autumn, which was based on Mari Sandoz's account of that exodus. And this is, I think, a very beautiful painting of that. This is one I happen to own and I'm thrilled to own. This is a painting of a cattle stampede in a thunderstorm. Then I can just give you a quick sense. His drawings are somewhat more primitive at times. There's again Dewey Beard. But this is a man of unbelievable, to spend 20 years living on the Great Plains amongst native peoples in order to listen, to get the oral tradition of these stories and not just accept white historians' views of them. What a monumental achievement that was.
Well, we certainly invite everyone afterwards to take a look at the pictures out there and of these. But what I'd like to do now is get response, argument, comments. We're certainly wide open to all of that. Yes, sir.
Go ahead and repeat that. Want to repeat it?
Yeah.
We're repeating because they're, we're streaming and all of that technologically, but the suggestion was that this is reminiscent of apartheid in South Africa or what's happening in the Middle East today. Both of those analogies have some real validity. Just to take a very kind of a geopolitical perspective on this, so just to kind of remove all human sympathy out of it and just talk about it in terms of the dynamics of cultures. When a strong, conquering culture meets indigenous peoples, the pattern is often the same. You form initial treaties until you realize what you need or want. Those treaties break down. There are border skirmishes. Sometimes this leads to outbreaks of real wars. There's an attempt to divide and conquer and to put people into island cultures. You think of the settlements on the West Bank, it's very similar to creating white settlements in Indian country. Then a depredation occurs, then the white army comes out to protect the settlers. There's a lot of this. I mean, this is sort of back into Theodore Roosevelt's realm of the white man's burden or the Anglo-Saxon mission in the world. But the way to understand this, Larry, it's so important. We can't understand this unless we get ourselves into the mindset of the conquerors as well as the victims. The conquerors were just consumed by the notion that they were fulfilling something noble, good, progressive, unneeding of defense. The white conquerors of the Great Plains were really sure that they were doing the right thing. We have the advantage of looking at it 100 years later and not being as attached to the mythology of the U.S. expansion as perhaps they were. But you can't understand this if you simply demonize them. At the same point, this is the hardest question in the humanities. Okay, so you don't want to demonize them, and yet, by any rational analysis, this was a horrible conquest of a sovereign people who were effectively minding their own business. Mm-hmm. So how do you sort that out? You're not, okay, good.
Well, no, I know we got more questions out here. Yes, sir.
My name is Dr. Jim Garrett, and I'm an enrolled member of Cheyenne River Reservation, and also a direct descendant of Chief Bigfoot.
Would you turn and speak to them?
I applaud you for your level of scholarship on this issue. And I really am struggling inside to say what I need to say here. All of these events that you describe here today was over one thing: land. And Sitting Bull was killed because he was advocating no more giving up of land. That was why he was killed. The whole ghost dance thing was a ruse to put down those leaders that advocated no more giving up of land. Sitting Bull was one of those. Bigfoot was one of those people, many, many more. Chief Bigfoot was a man of peace. And he was also suffering from pneumonia when he and his family and the Hunkpapas that joined them decided to go to Wounded Knee. I know all of this because I did a lot of research on this particular issue because I was one of the originators of the Bigfoot Ride in 1986 through 1990. And we did this because we wanted to wipe the tears of those of our people who were mourning the loss of these people. Because in 1884, the federal government banned all traditional religious ceremonies in a country that was supposed to be founded on freedom of religion. One of those ceremonies, the 7 sacred rites of the Lakota, is the Wachigala. The Wachigala is the literal wiping of the tears when you lose a loved one. And ever since 1890, when this massacre happened, we were not allowed to wipe the tears of our family, of our relatives. And so that's the purpose of that Bigfoot Ride, was because of all the 7 sacred ceremonies of the Lakota, the people almost forgot how to do this Wachigala, the songs and the words that go to that. And so on that Bigfoot Ride, what we did for 5 years was we assigned all of our people who were from different reservations and different communities to go home and talk to the oldest people in your community and find out if there's any amongst them that know these songs and these words, and bring them back next year, and we would do that. And we had that Wachigala in 1990 on December 22nd. And that was the first time in over 100 years that ceremony had been performed. And what happened was we wiped the tears of the entire Lakota nation because of this. Things have been getting better since we wiped the tears because the people have formally come out of the mourning period. So this is still a really emotional issue, and what I applaud your choosing of words here today, because this is so iconic to the Dakotas, in the sense that this is so, even though it's over 100 years, it's still very much in the hearts of the people around here. I have a friend who says that it wasn't by coincidence that in 1905 the United States issued a nickel with the head of a buffalo on one side and the head of an Indian on the other, and what they were commemorating was the extinction of both, only it didn't happen. Anyway, I don't mean to take over your microphone. I just wanted to say that that was the purpose of that Bigfoot Ride, was to wipe the tears of this nation.
Thank you, sir, and you honor us by being here today. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Kathy. I'm wondering if there's any Bigfoot riders. Like, I'm a Bigfoot rider, and I'm wondering if there's anyone here.
It's one of them.
Would you stand up? This is, we're related in a sense because we did this. And today in this weather, it was like that for 2 weeks. It was, we were outside. I had gloves on, and I had long underwear. Those people didn't, they walked, and you couldn't spend one day out there without remembering them. And it was about wiping the tears.
Thank you, ma'am.
Could you
Appreciate
just
it.
quickly summarize, because for the streaming, people are talking
Oh,
about.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You know, you said that, can I get you to say it again with the mic. You did such a beautiful job.
I'm a little emotional, sorry. Thank you. Would you come up here and stand with me? I would feel better, please. The days, like today, it was like that for 2 weeks. We left Sitting Bull's camp December 15th, and we rode for 2 weeks down. Shake your hand. Thank you. And we did this for the wiping of the tears. And when we rode every day, we got up very early in the morning. We had a coffee. We saddled our horses up, and we rode. And 234 miles, I think it is. It's basically the length of South Dakota. And we got down to Wounded Knee. It was a day worse than today. The snow was going sideways. And we had gathered people up all along the way. People started. There were only 15 riders when we left Sitting Bull's camp. And when we got down there, you saw in the pictures, it were just gangs of people. They had come from all the stops along the way, from Cherry Creek and Bridger, and it's just very emotional for me. And so we got down there, and I'm standing in that cemetery, and I told Jim it's like standing in some vortex on the planet. The emotion and the feeling, the energy down there is just incredible. And they're doing this ceremony with the native spiritual people, and they had the staffs there, and I look over and I see the church where the uprising happened on Pine Ridge, and I was imagining what it was like. It was kind of quiet except the wind blowing, but the battles that were there, you could almost hear the guns that went off, and it was something I'll never forget, obviously. Maybe you can say something about your experience if you want to.
Well, I've done my ride when I was 16 years old by my uncle Dana. He was the one that got me interested in a very long time ago, just telling stories about the ride. And the stories that I've heard on the way to prepare myself for this was just, emotional, overwhelming, and it has a purpose. Mentally, physically, spiritually, it gets you ready for where you came from. I'm a mixture of Menikoji and Oglala Sioux on my mother and father's side. And knowing the history of Wounded Knee and what transpired there, it brings me back to being grateful to have today with traditional family, outside family, and the one thing that I left with the Wounded Knee, like the Bigfoot ride, was a heavy heart. Just knowing that people of your family is buried in a grave. It's very, very emotional. And it's very hard to speak right now about it. And that's what my experience was, just being gratified with what I learned from that day and what I still have today.
Thank you very much. We appreciate those comments very much. Sir, you mentioned that freedom of religion. And we all know that we always talk about that freedom of religion in the United States, and I know I've always taught my students that at the founding of the United States, the freedom of religion was you could be a Congregationalist. It was the freedom to be a Congregationalist as opposed to the Church of England or whatever else it might be. And so it's a very limited freedom, and that reminds me of a story. In fact, Clay and I were talking about this earlier this afternoon. Charles Eastman, himself a native who educated in the East, became a doctor and all of that. And he tells a story in a book that he wrote. It's called Soul of the Indian. And he tells a story of a missionary talking to some Indian gentlemen, and he's telling the story about the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and the apple, the tempting of Satan and all that sort of stuff. So, and they sit there very politely and they listen to him tell the whole story. And he got all done, and one of the Indian gentlemen said, well, now I've got a story I want to tell you. And he started telling the story about the Great Spirit and maize, and there was, went on, and the missionary got really upset, and he said, just a minute, what I was telling you is about true religion. You're telling me myths and fables. And the Indian gentleman looked at him and says, now we were polite and listened to you. You should be polite and listen to us. But the missionary wouldn't, because the missionary was so convinced what he was talking about was real. And we see so many examples of that. But any more questions or comments? Scott? I'll even give you the mic.
Thank you, President Scogan and Mr. Jacobson. I just, you know, throughout this whole event here today, I just jotted down some notes that really compare to what we're working on today and trying to make a correlation of what's happening here today. Is, you know, with us all living together here in North Dakota, Bismarck, particular, you know, it's always very important that we really try to understand each other, no matter if we're German, Russian, Lakota, Hunkpapa, like I am, you know, Scandinavian. We all live and share many things here in North Dakota and in this community. And it's events like this that I'm really working very hard on in trying to bridge cultures, you know, and trying to understand and respect each other as far as how we think and act and behave. And you know, growing up, you know, I wasn't so fortunate in understanding where things like this happen, because in my history classes, these things were not talked about. And when they were, it was more or less, you know, our fault as a Lakota. It was our fault as to why we were massacred. And so going back home to my mother and father, I'm saying, you know, well, what happened here? You know, and being my father, a doctor like Mr. Scogan, administrator, he told me what exactly happened. My mother, my relatives down in Standing Rock. And so now to where we're at here today is tremendous, I think, very tremendous from Lakota and Native American standpoint, that we are here together, you, the non-Native people here. I'm really very, very encouraged that you took the time out of your day here Sunday to come and listen to the a travesty that occurred here in our history, and to really understand it. Again, not to, you know, blame anything, not to have a heavy heart, those type of things, but just to understand, and given that opportunity to understand that this happened is tremendous. And again, that's the things that I work on in my office, and not only as what I do at work, but me personally, you know, and getting involved in a lot of things in our community, because I love Bismarck. You know, I love their state, I love my tribes, and again, it's so good to see that you know, Dr. Scogan and Mr. Jacobson have done this, and I know it'd be a little nervous. I'd be nervous too. You know, I think it'd be like me and Mr. Redbird or Dr. Garrett going up to say wherever and trying to tell your story about being a Scandinavian or a German Russian. You know, you'd be thinking like, who are these guys up here trying to tell me about our history? You know, so there's always two ways that they look at things. You know, and as long as we can do that and say, hey, you know what, I get your meaning. You know, I understand you, and I think that's what it's really about. And you know, from there we grow, and from there we prosper. We understand each other, and we live well. You know, it's just also I think the students here too. I think that's another way that we really try to change I always call it the snowball of understanding, the snowball of the diversity that we go through. Is that how do we change a mindset from, say, an elderly fella that's kind of set in his or her ways, you know, on the Indian side and non-Indian side. But how do we change mindsets, and how do we really understand? And it always begins with our youth, with our little ones, you know, our sacred ones, and our students here, especially at BSC, taking the time to write a paper. I see a few students here writing a paper about what they're learning here, and applying that, and finally saying, you know what, yes, I do understand that. And maybe what I was told or growing up, you know, is a little different. And so it is kind of rewriting the history books, so to speak, you know, and again, those history books are so important, especially to North Dakota. We all share a very, very rich history here of how we migrated here, how we were always the first peoples here, and relaying that all back to the land, you know, of cattle, the buffalo, you know, the horses, the great river that we all share, all those things that we hold very, very dear to us as North Dakotans and as tribal nations. You know, again, just getting back to what Sitting Bull, you know, Dr. Garrett was, of course, very right as far as how this all transpired, but, you know, Sitting Bull was first and foremost a spiritual man. He was not a violent man, spiritual man, you know, and he's peaceful, and he's really trying to extend his mind and his spirituality out way beyond the limits of what he could do as far as understanding why this is happening to my people. Why? What have I done? You know, his quote of being, is it because of, am I wicked because of my skin is red? You know, all those things he battled in trying to, you know, in survival mode of what he needed to do and doing the great lengths that to help his people survive. And you know, when I look at that picture right there, you know, I sat there and I cried. I had tears in my eyes about that trail. You know, and there is a movie about that. It's called Ghost Riders, and it's a documentary. I really encourage you to watch it. And it tells you the tale of how this all came about, and it's really a good movie. But again, I want to thank you, and the things I'm working on here in the city with you folks. I consider you as a partner, as a brother, sister, in providing, you know, forums like this to that bring us all together and share the good stories and not so good stories about what some of the challenges that we went through as Lakota people, as Hidatsa people, or as a Scandinavian, or as a German. You know, I am too, and very interested in hearing your stories as well of what that's some of the challenge that you have went through as well. So, again, Dr. Scogan, thank you very much, and I give these gentlemen applause up here.
Okay, do we have any more? I know the hour is growing late here, 40 minutes to kick off. Does anybody have any? Yes, sir. The question is, were there long-term repercussions for Royer or McLaughlin?
Royer was almost immediately dismissed from the service, and he never came back. So Royer had a very short career as an Indian agent, and he was regarded universally as sort of a ninny. But it's worse than being a ninny, because it's a ninny who inadvertently, through his panic, touched off a catastrophe. And I feel very certain that if Valentine McGillicuddy had still been there, or even Gallagher, who was his predecessor, that this wouldn't have happened. You know, it's one thing to read a situation from your own lens, and we all try to do that. We have no choice but to do that. But an Indian agent who'd been there for 10 years could hear things in the Lakota way of dealing with this crisis that he could understand, he could contextualize, he could place. Royer had no context with which to hear this, and everything that he heard sounded alarmist, and that it was militant, and this was going to lead to a bloodbath and so on. He simply overreacted because he had no matrix of understanding about a culture that would have enabled him to respond more sensibly. And, you know, not to get political, but if we had in the State Department 50 or 60 Islamists, probably we wouldn't have invaded Iraq either. You have to understand other cultures' ways before you can understand their behavior. And their mindset is often runs on a different rhetorical path from your own. And Royer simply didn't. He was a druggist from Alpena, South Dakota, and he had no prior experience either in the land office or in Native American affairs. McLaughlin survived. McLaughlin was at the same newspapers that were stirring up hate against Sitting Bull. The minute Sitting Bull was martyred, came to his defense and said that the white government led by McLaughlin had overreacted and punished him unnecessarily. These were the same people who were calling him a demon and suggesting that the sooner he was removed from the face of the earth, the better. The minute it happened, they joined the other ranks and condemned McLaughlin. McLaughlin is a very interesting figure, and it would be very hard to characterize him in a few sentences, but he's not a bad man. He's a man, he was trying to do the best job that he possibly could as he understood the mission of the Indian reservations in his time. And he won a lot of friends amongst Native people in addition to enemies. And so you can't create a black and white picture of McLaughlin or any number of other people who were engaged in this thing, but it is unmistakable that McLaughlin used this crisis to get rid of Sitting Bull, and if he had just decided, I'm going to have to live with this guy for the rest of his life, and he's a nuisance, but he is what he is, the Wounded Knee catastrophe almost certainly wouldn't have happened. So he was investigated, and he was exonerated, and he went on to complete his career at Standing Rock.
Okay. Anybody have any last thoughts or words?
There's one right
Phil.
here.
Yes, sir.
I want to ask you your thoughts. I studied on 4 universities. It's the first time I've seen two people come together like you yourselves and to talk about this. And following up on Scott's comments about you look through your eyes at this event. I'm curious about how you feel and how you see the Wounded Knee incident carrying out into the 21st century. Through your eyes, what do you see?
Oh, my goodness, Phil. The question is, Clay and I have studied this and we've come together to talk about it, and how do we feel about it? Through our lens, how do we look at it? That's a heck of a question. It's a tough question. I'll let Mr. Jenkinson go first.
No, really, aren't you? That's it? That's all you've got? I'm with Valentine McGillicuddy. I mean, today, if this happened today, it would go almost immediately to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would say the Lakota have a right to their ghost dance because of the separation of church and state and the freedom of religion of the First Amendment. That was a lens that wasn't worn in that time. No one talked about it that way except Valentine McGillicuddy a little bit. Millennial movements, I mean, there are millennial movements in the history of Christianity and the history of almost every other religion, and they all miscarry on the same problem, that the end doesn't come when the prophet predicts it, and they all peter out when that happens. And so time was on the side of patience and restraint here, but it didn't happen for lots of different reasons. And I mean, one reason why Wounded Knee is regarded as the last gasp of Indian resistance to the white conquest of the continent is because that's partly true. That these land grabs were going on. I think what Mr. Garrett said was exactly right. These land grabs were occurring, and we weren't going to give up until we had reached a statistical minimum. And if Dawes and others had had their way, the reservations would have been terminated, and Indians would have been privatized and detribalized until there would be no Indian country left. There would simply be people of Indian ethnicity. That was the overall plan of the government in the post-Civil War period. It failed for lots of different reasons. And so this dynamism of the white Euro-American industrial manifest destiny culture was going to take the Great Plains one way or the other. And when the reservation was split into 6 in 1889, there was a sense in which, if not now, when? Is there a last stand? Is there some time when this has to be completed? And I think both cultures were thinking there has to be some resolution moment when this is settled once and for all, and in a certain way, Wounded Knee satisfied that cultural imperative for both cultures, tragically, but it did create the closure of a movement that had begun in the time of the proclamation of 1763, if not before. So when I look at it, I see two things. One is that you can't understand your history unless you actually spend time looking at it. And so that's, you know, in 2 short hours, that's a little bit of what we've attempted to do today. The other thing is that, I mean, now I'll go out on a limb, but I think that the Great Plains have a troubled karma, because these things occurred, and we all know that they occurred, and we acknowledge that they occurred, and we even accept that they occurred, but we haven't come to terms with them exactly. And so before we can go on, before we can heal the white Indian chasm, which I think is a huge chasm in Great Plains life, we have to do a couple of things. And the first thing is we have to acknowledge the wound in both cultures. And secondly, we have to create a dialogue. And thirdly, we have to do something that amounts to genuine acts of mutual respect and reconciliation. And I think we're just beginning this process. This is a long, difficult cultural process, and frankly, and I'm a deep lover of North Dakota life and a North Dakota patriot, but I don't think that the white population of North Dakota is quite ready yet to do that. But until we do it, I think that this will be a bloody ground here, and doing it won't cost us anything that we don't need to do anyway to fulfill our own destiny in the 21st century. So I say more dialogue, and if it's going to take some chaos, let's wrestle it to the ground. But I don't see any reason to turn away and say that was then and this is now, because we know that's not true.
I'm going to very quickly respond to what Clay said. Then I'll answer your question, and then we'll call it a wrap here. To begin with, this is the reason Clay and I came together 2 years ago and had lunch. The first time we met each other, we went out to lunch because Clay had written that there are conversations North Dakotans need to have. And I was so intrigued. I was just new back to the state, and I sat there at lunch with Clay, and we talked about a lot of things and sort of kicked around things that need to be talked about in North Dakota, and this is one of them. The conversations North Dakotans need to have. And, and it goes on, and, water rights and oil exploration and coal mining and, all the things that we do in North Dakota, we just need to talk about them. And one of the big things Clay and I believe is that we have to be able to have a civil conversation, to sit down and talk like this. So I really appreciate that we had this opportunity today to do that. And so responding to exactly what Clay was saying is we just need to have this conversation. And there's a number of topics that we have to talk about. So I do appreciate my being able to be up here with Clay and to have these conversations. In answer to your question about lenses and looking through lenses, as a historian, what I think we have to do is when we go back in time, and there are historians, I've got colleagues that will say that you can reach back in time and you can bring people forward and you can judge them and you can argue with them in context of today. And I always believe it's important that we go back to their time and try to understand the context. And one thing my friend I know deals with a lot is Thomas Jefferson and the issue of slavery, for example. Is it fair to judge Thomas Jefferson by today's standards, or do we have to judge him by his own standards in his own time? And so looking at this incident, when I look at the incident, I have, through the lens that I look at, I have gained a greater appreciation on two fronts. On one front is that I believe there really was a lot of fear. Unfounded fear, irrational fear. There was a lot of fear on both sides. After Sitting Bull was killed and his people are fleeing and Bigfoot is trying to get around the Army and he's trying to get to Pine Ridge, those are people afraid. They're afraid. They know the Army's moving. They're afraid. On the edges of the reservation, we have white settlers. They're afraid. And so, on one hand, I've gained a greater appreciation of the fear on both sides. On the other hand, I believe we can judge what occurred on that day. The first shot is fired, and we end up with, to use Clay's term, a killing field. And we can condemn them because they were condemned themselves. One of the officers got out of the Army and went and taught at MIT. And he ended up resigning from there because he was completely ostracized by the student body. This is in 1890s. He's completely ostracized by the student body at MIT because they said he participated in a massacre. And so we can condemn what occurred after that first shot. And prior to that, I think we can have an understanding and appreciation for all sides. Now, I know it's past 5 o'clock, and Perry's just dying to say something.
But to bring that to a final interesting conclusion, they gave out 20 Medal of Honor for soldiers involved in Wounded Knee, which showed that there was no appreciation for the massacre. It was considered by that time the military event, and unfortunately, 20 Medal of Honor winners.
There were 20, yes, for you didn't hear that. There were 20 Medal of Honors, one, if you will, one. Although those are sort of a domino thing. One guy got it, the other guy said, well, I did more than he did, so they gave him one, and then two guys said, well, we did more than they did, and so it was really a terrible, terrible It tarnished Medal of Honors, for sure.
As we all rush back to our wide screens, can I just thank Randy Hudson-Buehler and Shyla Schaefer for making these David Humphreys Miller paintings. And if you've got a huge bet in the game today, and you win $1.5 million, you could buy this collection and help Randy get his museum in Medora for this very set of things. Yes, Shyla?
I was just going to say to Dr. Scogin, this has been wonderfully interesting, and then the small part of it, it's not even in the right context of the whole discussion of Wounded Knee, but bringing light to David Humphrey Miller's and those eight paintings that we were able to bring down that have been in storage for too many years. I thank you, and I want to tell you that there's no point in putting them back in storage until we have a permanent place, and if you are willing to keep them on display for a period of time, we would like that.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.